Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here virtually to present the climate and drought outlook for the Midwest and High Plains regions. If I was to sum up my entire talk today, and I think as we all know, May 2019 has been one for the record books. It's been extremely wet, and conditions have caused more flooding issues later into May. We've also seen impacts to the growing season. Odds are really tilted towards this continuing in upcoming weeks in the Midwest and portion of the High Plains region. So I'll talk more about that throughout my presentation today. Before you get started, I want to mention that my presentation draws from a lot of information, data, analyses, and lots of helpful discussions over the last couple of days across state and federal partners. More specifically, the regional climate services for the North Central United States are provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Drought Mitigation Center, Midwest Regional Climate Center, and as well the American Association of State Climatologists. So I appreciate many helpful conversations from local climate or state climate offices over the last couple of days. Just so you don't miss it, the next webinar is going to be on July 18th. The presenter for the webinar is still to be, or yet to be determined. Everybody's pretty busy right now. Archives of the past webinars and this webinar today can be found at the links that I've listed at the bottom of this slide. So just a general overview of my presentation today. It's going to focus on how the conditions we've experienced in the last couple of months compared to our historical conditions dating back to 1895, how these conditions affect our progression into the summer, some of our current and prospective impacts. We've certainly got a lot to talk about there, but those impacts that we've experienced, and then a discussion of the recent climate and drought outlooks that were released early this morning. I'm going to do my best, as Doug mentioned, and attempt to complete all of this in the next 30 to 40 minutes to hopefully have time for wrap-up and plenty of time for questions and further discussion. So let's start by taking a look at temperature and precipitation rankings for the last 3 months. So the general story here, and this is from the NOAA's National Center for Environmental Information, and the general story is that it continues to be really cool and wet. So these rankings are from the National Center for Environmental Information and NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. And here I'm comparing March through May average temperature and precipitation to those that we've experienced or that have occurred over the past 125 years. Larger numbers up to 125 indicate very warm conditions in red or very wet conditions in green. Smaller numbers down to 1 indicate increasingly cooler temperatures in blue or very dry conditions in brown. Figure on the left shows the statewide temperature ranks across the region. In general, the majority of the High Plains and portions of the Midwest have experienced below average temperatures, as we all know, for the 3-month period, and this has been a continued trend. South Dakota experienced one of its top 10 coldest March to May time periods with temperatures much below average. These reduced temperatures can be attributed to a persistent trough or persistent storm tracks and trough in the jet stream that has brought subarctic air out of Canada. Further east, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky have experienced normal to much above normal temperatures. Okay, moving over to the figure on the right, the 3-month precipitation rankings tell a continued story. It's been really wet in the Midwest and portions of the High Plains. There's been a steady inflow of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico into the interior of the United States. In the Plains, Kansas experienced its wettest March to May period on record. Neighboring states approached precipitation amounts that were much above average, some cases in the top 10 of all years recorded. Further north, Montana and North Dakota were the only states in the High Plains that experienced near normal to below average precipitation. In the Midwest, similar trends were observed with precipitation rankings that were much above average. Tennessee and Kentucky were the only states to see near average precipitation amounts in the last 3 months. So I've shown the same maps here as in the last slide, but with temperature and precipitation rankings for May only, so the previous month. And again, May was very similar to the trend that has continued since March and earlier in the year. In the High Plains region, you see that the majority of states are dark blue, and this indicates that much below average temperatures have occurred. For the Midwest, temperatures were below average in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And to the south and east, temperatures were near normal in Illinois and Indiana, and trended towards above average for Kentucky and Ohio. Moving on to the figure on the right, or precipitation. As we all know, it's a record-breaking month across much of the High Plains and Midwest, excepting Montana and really North Dakota. Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas experienced their wettest Mays ever. Similarly, the surrounding states experienced much above average to above average precipitation for the month. These precipitation totals contributed to significant flooding across the Missouri River, Upper Mississippi, and Ohio and Tennessee Valley river systems. I'll discuss more of the impacts related to flooding and these record precipitation amounts in later slides. Okay, so let's move forward into June and what we've experienced in the last couple of weeks. In this slide, I've shown the temperature departure from the mean for June 1st to the 18th, or excuse me, to the 18th. Temperatures from this window of time are compared across the period from 1981 to 2010. Here, gray values indicate near normal temperatures. Green shading represents colder than normal temperatures, and orange to red shading indicates warmer than normal temperatures. As you look across the region, generally June temperature trends have been between 2 to 3 degrees warmer for eastern Montana and portions of the Dakotas. The trend of below normal temperatures has continued for states surrounding the Great Lakes and southward into Kentucky. Here, the temperatures range from 1 to 4 degrees below normal for early June. The remainder of the region has experienced near normal temperatures so far to date. Okay, here's a look at June's precipitation as a percentage of the mean value from 1981 to 2010. As an example of how to read this figure, light red areas would represent 2% of the mean, or almost no precipitation across the last 2 weeks. Light green areas would represent approximately 100% of the normal precipitation for this time period. Blue to purple shading indicates upwards of 200 to 300%, or 3 times the normal precipitation that we would receive between June to June 18th. So the general story here is in the High Plains region and portions of the Midwest, we had a reprieve from the moist conditions. This is indicated by the orange to red shading extending in a northerly direction from Iowa and westwards towards Colorado. Wisconsin and Illinois had near normal to slightly below normal precipitation amounts. But further east, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee have received significant precipitation in the last 5 days. Amounts in these areas have totaled upwards of 150 to 300% of normal for early June. And these conditions have contributed to another rise in floodwaters across the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. I'll talk more about that in a couple of slides. Okay, moving beyond total precipitation, let's take a look at snow conditions for the western portions of the region. It seems strange to be talking about snowpack in June, but there is still some snow water equivalent left in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And it's important. Snow water equivalent represents the depth of water that we would have if we completely melted the snowpack in a given location in the mountains at higher elevations. This mountain snow water equivalent is one of the primary factors used to predict May through July runoff in the Missouri River Basin. During the 3-month runoff period, roughly 50% of the annual runoff enters the main stem system as a result of mountain snowmelt and rainfall runoff. So the figures in this slide, courtesy of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they include time series plots of the average mountain snow water equivalent beginning on October 1st of 2018 through yesterday. The current average snow water equivalent values are based upon all snow tell gauges or snow measurement locations for the headwater basin above Fort Peck in Montana and the incremental basin on the right-hand side from Fort Peck to Garrison Junction. So the current average snow water equivalent values are indicated by the blue shaded area, and the 1981 to 2010 average is indicated with the red line. So what you can see from this figure, on June 19th, the mountain snow water equivalent in the total above Fort Peck reach was about 1.5 inches, or 46% of the June 17th average. 46% of the June 19th average. For this basin, 8% of this year's peak remains, 6% of this peak remains. For the reach from total Fort Peck to Garrison, there was approximately 2.2 inches, or 17% of the peak remaining. Okay, so thinking about our current snowpack and what the continued snowmelt means for reservoir storage and streamflow along the Missouri River, this graph shows the combined storage capacity for the Fort Peck, Garrison, and Oahe reservoirs in millions of acre feet. The green line shows system storage in 2018, and the red line is this year. So what you can see from this time series is that system storage increased much earlier and faster this year than it did in 2018. However, it's likely to remain high with continued snowmelt from the mountains and above normal rainfall. Our current storage is 67.8 million acre feet. Importantly, 11.7 million acre feet of the 16.3 million acre feet of flood control storage is occupied when accounting for all of the reservoirs, so Fort Peck, Garrison, and Oahe reservoirs together. So of this, about 28% of the flood control storage remains available to store additional runoff as we receive it. Okay, so taking a look at soil moisture and values of soil moisture across the region, the recent months' precipitation in the Midwest and High Plains has really set the stage for soil moisture conditions. Soil moisture is factored in the forecast as an indicator of wet or dry basin conditions and can contribute to drought or flooding, depending upon antecedent conditions as we move into the summer. I've shown the Climate Prediction Center's modeled soil moisture percentile ranking for June 19th in this figure. Low soil moisture percentiles from 20 to down to 1% are indicated with light orange to red shading. Surpluses of moisture with percentiles from 80 to 100% are indicated by light green to dark green shading. Locations with soil moisture surpluses for this time of year include states surrounding the Great Lakes region and Midwestern states extending into South Dakota and Wyoming. Kansas and Oklahoma have the highest soil moisture anomaly with moisture percentiles upward of 100%, so well-saturated soils. Additional areas that stand out in terms of soil moisture deficits include northeastern Montana and North Dakota, which range from the 10th to 1st percentile for this time of year. So things are really starting to dry down in those regions, and as I'll discuss later, those coincide with areas, some of the only areas that are in current drought status in the western U.S. So looking directly at current stream flow conditions, here's a map of USGS stream gauges and flow rankings across the Plains and Midwest region for the past week, actually for yesterday. Across the gauge network, black to blue symbols indicate greater than 90th percentile flows for this time period. Light blue is between 76th to 90th percentile. Green is from the 25th to 75th percentile. And orange is in the 10th to 24th percentile. The big story this past month was the extensive amount of flooding that occurred across Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky, pretty much all of the Midwest, as a result of the continued record rainfall amounts. I'll talk a little bit more about these areas in the next slide. Generally, June runoff for the upper Missouri River Basin and the Platte River Basins are normal to above normal, so much above normal for what is expected this time of year. Flows should continue to remain high as our remaining mountain snowpack melts out and with anticipated wet conditions in the upcoming weeks. Should point out that flows are receding. While they are high, they are beginning to recede. Okay, here's a closer look at the aftermath of the floods that I mentioned in the Midwest region. The figure on the left shows gauges across the region that are still currently in flood stage. So things are finally beginning to calm down on the Mississippi, with all flow on the upper Mississippi, Illinois, and Missouri rivers continuing to very slowly fall. Moderate flooding still occurring from around Gladstone, Illinois, with mostly minor flooding downstream on the Mississippi River at Winfield. Downstream of here, major flooding continues to around Chester, Illinois. Many of these areas that I've shown in this map are expected to remain at flood stage through July. Many of these areas have also set new flow records over the past month. As an example, the Mississippi River at Rock Island was above flood stage for almost 96 days, and it beats its previous record of 43 days set in 1993. So a really big flow year this year with continued precipitation. Moving further west, the Missouri Basin seems to have turned a corner. All locations along the Missouri River are now below the major flooding category. Most mountain locations in the upper Missouri and Yellowstone basins are either at their crest or past their crest. Flooding in the plains has also subsided quite a bit, with most of the tributaries now below flood stage. For the main stem of the Missouri, only minor or moderate flooding is occurring from Nebraska City to its junction with the Mississippi. If we move further east, so heavy rains over the last 5 days have occurred over the Ohio Valley, and they're causing rises in the lower Ohio River. As these flows spill into the lower Mississippi, this may cause renewed rises beginning later in next week. Okay. One positive, so I've highlighted a lot of the moisture conditions, but a real positive of the cool and wet conditions over the last couple of months is that we've been at a continued historic low drought levels. So let's take a look today at today's drought monitor, and this is drawn out by Brad Pugh. The Midwest region remained drought-free on the map this week. Overall, the region has been anomalously wet during the past 12-month period, as well as on shorter timescales. Notable area of drought in the High Plains region is northern North Dakota and into northeastern Montana. Drought in these areas persisted or worsened from abnormally dry conditions to D1 and D2 levels. And this expansion was in relation to short-term precipitation deficits and a lot of reported impacts in the agricultural sectors, such as rangeland forage production. Some ranchers are beginning to cull their herds due to the onset of drought conditions in these areas. Okay, so let's turn our focus from kind of conditions that we've experienced to some of the major impacts associated with the wet and cool weather. There's been no shortage of impacts, and we could spend hours discussing individual events. We certainly did spend a lot of time yesterday on our phone call and highlighting individual events that have occurred across the region. In this slide, I've summarized some of the key events related to flooding so far. As kind of some key impactful events, there have been at least 9 reported deaths associated with stranded motorists across the region and being stranded in floodwaters, drowning. Flooding of rivers and lakes has impacted homes, vehicles, everything from navigation, roadways, railroads, as well as significant damage to water conveyance infrastructure across the region. This has contributed to billions of dollars, upwards of billions of dollars in damages, and time will tell how significant those damages have been and will be. Just as one example, I-29 from north of St. Joseph to Iowa border has been closed or had been closed since May 29th after storms dropped record amounts of rainfall across the plains and saturated the Missouri River. After nearly 3 weeks, Interstate 29 north of St. Joseph is back open for drivers, and I've shown a picture of it in the upper left-hand corner. Record water levels in the Great Lakes, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but they've combined with winds and have led to an increase in storm surges and flooding of nearby homes and roads. There's been significant erosion in nutrient export from agricultural lands, and it's expected to cause harmful algal blooms in both the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. This may cascade into impacts due to hypoxia and oxygen depletion of our fisheries due to depleted oxygen levels. Another key impact that was reported and discussed today across the Great Lakes region and even into the Dakotas and Montana is that there have been many reports of mosquito outbreaks and stagnant water bodies across the region. And that's become quite an issue. Okay, moving on to the Great Lakes. Here's an image showing daily water levels, just to highlight how significant the water level rises in the Great Lakes have been. So I'm showing daily water level rises for Superior, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. And this same trend occurs across all of the Great Lakes. I'm just showing a subset of the water levels for the lakes. 2019 water levels are shown with the red line, and the record high monthly mean is shown as the dashed black line, upper dashed line in each plot. Importantly, and what you can take away from these images is that all the lakes are currently above their record high water levels. It's expected that the lakes will exceed these record high water levels for months to come, with continued wet conditions coming in the forecast. Again, I'll note that I haven't shown data for all of the lakes, but they show similar trends. Related to these water levels and surges in the water levels, some important impacts include storm surges and frequent emergency warnings during periods of high sustained wind. Many adjacent roadways are flooded, and this has limited travel. Homes, vehicles, and other infrastructure have been damaged. And a key impact is that significant erosion and nutrient exports, so nitrogen and phosphorus, are expected to cause harmful algal blooms and a record dead zone in the Great Lakes. Doug Cluck mentioned that there is some hope in the lake area that delayed planting and reduced fertilizer loads due to reduced acreage planted may reduce phosphorus loads even though flows are high for Lake Erie area.
And Doug Cluck's that was speculation, not on Doug Cluck's part, but on other people's part. That even though with the phenomenal amount of water predicted, and the actual prediction on those harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie will come out, I think, in the middle of July for those interested.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, moving on to the other significant impacts that I'm sure are on all of our minds, agricultural impacts. Obviously, cold and wetness have delayed spring planting across the board in terms of the multiple crop types. As an example, corn plantings have been mostly finished, but in reality, a significant amount of the planted acreage went into the ground very recently. So there's significant worry that that corn won't accumulate enough growing degree days to come to maturity and fruition. In addition, some beans are still being planted for southern areas of the Midwest, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in following slides. Crop development has been delayed across the board for corn, wheat, soybeans, and many other crops. And due to the continued wet and cool conditions, multiple millions of acres in the Midwest are not going to be planted. So this has contributed to uncertainty and really a lot of stress amongst producers in combination with reduced crop prices that currently exist. Weeds are becoming a problem because of delays of getting into fields with sprayers. So lots of inundated acreage is shown in this image at the bottom left-hand corner. In addition, because of increased moisture, there's time for water to sit on the crops, keep them wet, and really increase disease potential. Crop diseases from ample moisture are becoming widespread, and this is especially prevalent in winter wheat right now. Looking forward, crops are generally not in great condition, and they're going to continue, or it's speculated that it'll continue to struggle through the season unless we begin to see some warmer conditions. I guess I'd highlight that a good outcome is that pasture and range are quite good, except for the ability to cut and dry hay, and I'll show a figure of that and detailed image of that in a few slides. I guess the anomaly here is, and on a different note, Montana and North Dakota are actually beginning to experience dry conditions and impacts to rangeland forage and crops for portions of those states. Okay. So I wanted to take a few more minutes to focus on impacts of the cool and wet weather on crops around the region. Here I've shown a weekly National Agricultural Statistics crop condition report for corn, and I've shown two images. The map on the left shows emergence for the corn acreage that has been planted. Again, a lot of acreage has not been planted, but this shows of that acreage how much has actually emerged from the ground. Colors on the map represent differences relative to the last 5 years, with orange to brown representing decreases in emergence. So you can see that the vast majority of the area has shown a decrease in emergence relative to the last 5 years. For the U.S. as a whole, 79% of the corn crop that was planted has emerged, and this represents as a whole about an 18% decrease relative to the 5-year average. The figure to the right shows the percentage of the corn crop that is in good to excellent condition across the region. States in green have between 70 to 80% of their corn crop in good to excellent condition. The majority of the area, however, if you look across the board, is in white, and this indicates that only 40 to 59% of the corn crop is in good to excellent condition, and that tracks back to wet conditions, disease, and issues related to disease, but also just cool conditions that have not allowed that crop to accumulate enough growing degree days. For the U.S. as a whole, this represents about a 19% decrease relative to last year. Okay, another key impact for beans, I've shown the percentage of acreage planted for soybeans this year. There's still some planting happening in the southern portions of the Midwestern area. However, planting is beginning to wrap up, and significant amounts of land have not been planted due to, again, wet conditions and saturated soils, inundated fields. The orange to brown shading on the map on the left represents decreases in acreage planted relative to the past 5 years. Areas of orange represent 10 to 20% decreases, and brown represents upwards of a 50% decrease. Again, there have been significant decreases across the board. For the U.S. as a whole, the planted acreage for soybeans is at about 77%, and this is about a 16% decrease from the U.S. 5-year average. Okay, if we move over to the right, looking at the percentage of the beans that have actually emerged, the numbers are still pretty low so far. Orange to brown shading across the region represents a 10 to almost upwards of 55% decrease in beans that have emerged relative to the 5-year average. Again, of the acreage planted, approximately 55% of the soybeans have emerged across the U.S., and this represents a 29% decrease for the U.S. at this time in the year. So a pretty large decrease in soybean emergence due to cooler and wetter conditions. Okay. Getting to a glass is half full perspective on a positive aspect, the moisture across the region has been great for pasture and range conditions. Grass growth across the region has been significant, and there should be ample forage for cattle. This map shows the percentage of pasture and range areas in good to excellent condition. Light green to dark green shading represents states with 60 to 80% of their lands in good to excellent conditions. Areas in blue have between 80 to 90% of their rangelands in good to excellent condition. For the U.S. as a whole, 71% of the pasture and rangeland acreage is doing very well. So this represents an uptick or a 23% increase relative to last year. Okay, so let's moving forward into the future. Let's move on to our current conditions, from our current conditions and impacts to the outlook for the upcoming week. In this plot, I've shown the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast for the United States. The shading here represents the depth of expected precipitation or rainfall in inches. Expected values in our region range from about 1/10 of an inch in green to upwards of 5 inches in red from today's map. The key area that I think everybody's eyes are probably drawn to, and that I'll draw your attention to, is a storm system that's forecast to drop between about 1.5 inches to upwards of 5 inches of rainfall across the Midwest in the next 7 days. This area extends in a swath starting from Oklahoma and moving northeast to Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, and Ohio. There's also a band of higher precipitation extending from northeastern Montana and the Dakotas into the Midwest, and this could help alleviate some of the drought conditions in northeastern Montana and northern Dakota. It's going to be important to keep an eye on how this storm system develops and how much rainfall actually occurs, as much of the Midwest is very, very wet at this time and rivers are at flood stage. And I'll talk about that in this slide. Looking at
Kelsey, just one point of clarification, that it won't be one storm system. It'll be 2 or 3 storm systems over that period that will drop that rain. Just for clarification.
Thanks, Doug. And I'll highlight that in this slide. But yeah, to clarify, that is a 7-day forecast, and that amount of precipitation is expected to be well spread out across that 7-day period. And so when we think about what that means for current flooding and our flood forecast, Here I've shown the Flood Forecast Center's projected flooding from today through June 28th. When you look at this figure, it might seem a bit...
Welcome to
Hey, Doug, I just had an interruption. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you, Kelsey. This is Dennis.
Okay, maybe we lost Doug. Hopefully everybody else can still hear me. So in this flood forecast, purple symbols represent current areas and predicted areas of major flooding. Red represents areas of moderate flooding, and orange areas indicate minor flooding. Keep in mind that while this looks ominous, the upper main stem, Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers continue to fall, but they're still in moderate to major flood stages. So when we talk about the 7-day precipitation forecast, the 1 to 2 inches of rainfall over the next 7 days is not expected to cause significant river impacts or increased flooding, as it's going to be spread out across the 7-day period. Rainfall of 2 to 5 inches over parts of Arkansas and Missouri, extending into the Tennessee and Ohio river valleys, may cause some new minor flooding for portions of the area. So let's move on to the 8 to 14-day outlook. The NOAA Climate Prediction Center's 8 to 14-day outlook reflects the storm track that I just discussed in the 7-day precipitation outlook. On the left-hand side, temperatures are expected to be above normal for the majority of the region, as indicated by the orange to red shading on the figure to the left. Really only a small portion of central Montana is expected to have below normal temperatures. In the figure to the right, green shading indicates that Montana, the Dakotas, and portions of Wyoming are expected to be above normal for precipitation. In addition, southern portions of the Midwest can expect above normal precipitation. There is a chance of below normal precipitation for Colorado and portions of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Okay, so looking past the 8 to 14-day outlook, it's important to consider the El Niño Southern Oscillation and changes in the Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures. These ocean temperatures can impact regional air circulation patterns and in turn our local air temperatures and precipitation. Here I've shown the early June or mid-June ENSO forecast. Red bars indicate the probability of El Niño conditions extending through the summer and into early fall. El Niño is predicted to persist through the northern hemisphere summer through 2019, with lower odds of continuing through the fall, so 50 to 55% chance. And these conditions tilt the odds towards wetter and cooler conditions in the upcoming month for portions of the Midwest. Okay, the 1 month outlook reflects El Niño and the wet soil moisture conditions. These wet soil moisture conditions that we currently have will likely increase evaporative cooling across the region. So both the El Niño and soil moisture contribute to our monthly and 3-month outlook. So on the figure to the left, a large portion of the Midwest is expected to be cooler than normal, as indicated by a blue shading. This area includes all of Iowa and Missouri and portions of the surrounding states. It's going to be important to keep an eye on this forecast. These cooler temperatures are not what we need to speed up crop development across the region, so we should keep an eye on this forecast. Equal chances of above normal, normal, or below normal temperatures occur for the remainder of the region. Moving to the figure on the right, precipitation is expected to remain above normal across a large portion of the region, as indicated by the large green bullseye. This area extends from northeastern Montana and Wyoming into the Dakotas, down to Oklahoma, and as far east as Indiana. Equal chances of above normal, below normal, and normal precipitation are possible for Colorado, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. Okay, going out a bit further, so from July, August, and through September, looking at our 3-month seasonal outlook, Montana and portions of North Dakota, so looking at temperature, Montana and portions of North Dakota, western Wyoming, and western Colorado are predicted to have above normal temperatures. Similar to the 1-month forecast, there's still a large bullseye of below normal temperatures that are remaining in the Midwestern region. This area is centered across Nebraska and Kansas and extends into neighboring states. Going and looking towards precipitation, similar to the 1 month forecast again, you'll notice a large green swath extending from southern Montana downwards towards Missouri. Across this region, precipitation is expected to be above normal, and then the remaining areas of our region have equal chances of above normal or below normal precipitation, as indicated by the white shading. But the majority of our region, excepting some of the Great Lakes states, are expected to have above normal precipitation. Okay, just wanted to highlight, so thinking about the seasonal forecast, the odds are tilted towards cooler and wetter conditions in areas that have already experienced those conditions and are looking for relief. But some of the positive outlooks and outcomes of the continued wet and cool weather is that really we don't have to worry about significant drought and fire this year. If we think back to 2017, it's much different. So these are not expected to be significant issues in the upcoming months. On the left, I've shown the Climate Prediction Center's drought outlook for June through September, and this is the current map. The vast majority of the region is expected to steer clear of drought conditions. Again, the exception include portions of North Dakota and northeastern Montana. To the right is the July outlook for wildland fire potential. Enhanced moisture conditions and cooler temperatures will maintain litter and fuel moistures. So no significant wildland fire is expected for the region as a whole. I heard a laugh. Okay, so just to summarize my presentation today, really to sum it up, it's been historically wet and cooler than normal. We've seen record-setting floods across the region, but floodwaters are beginning to slowly decline. We've seen a lot of impacts in terms of agricultural impacts due to these historic weather conditions. One of the key impacts, and we won't fully realize the impact until later this year, is that millions of acres will remain unplanted, and time will tell what the economic losses this season are going to be. Warmer weather is really needed for maturity of crops that did make it into the ground, and pasture and range conditions are really good. The 1 month and 3 month forecasts suggest wet and cool conditions for a large portion of the region, and significant drought and wildfire conditions are unlikely to develop across the majority of the region. And with that, I'll wrap it up and take time for questions. In the slide, I've listed further information, so just information sources based on the data and analyses that I've shown today, key partners and websites that you can visit. And this will be online, and also key contacts related to this presentation, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hey, we just have a few questions, but before we get going, there's a couple remarks I want to make. First of all, I think you showed that Kansas broke a record in their month of May for their heaviest or their most precipitation for that month. Well, they actually broke it also, according to their state climatologist, Mary Knapp, for all time, for all months. And yeah, so it was the wettest May on record, or wettest month on record for Kansas. The other thing about snowpack, and I think you sort of hinted at this, is that it is lasting longer due to cooler than normal conditions. So if any of you are going on vacation to the west, you'll see that there's a considerable amount of snow still left there. Not that it's going to matter that much for in the next couple of weeks in terms of flooding and such, but certainly more snow left than normal due to just sort of lingering cool conditions and troughiness in the west.
My graduate students here in Missoula are still skiing some of the higher elevations.
Yeah, exactly. One other clarification on those outlooks is that, why don't you go down to the, let's just say the seasonal one, is that when either one. So when you see a big area like that map on the right with a lot of green on it, doesn't necessarily mean that chances are they're enhanced for above normal precipitation, but they're not necessarily more than the proper way to sort of address this is say there is a above normal chance for average to above normal precipitation, because there's an average. That's just the way we want to make that clear, because there's only a 40% increase, or slightly more than 40% increase of a chance of above normal precipitation, which means there's about 60% chance it won't be, just for clarification's sake, which probably didn't clarify anything to anybody. But it's the same is true for the temperature maps, where you see that little 40 in there means that there's a 40%, slightly greater than 40% chance of below normal temperatures in that area. Nonetheless, what we're saying here is we're leaning towards cooler and wetter, at least average to cooler and wetter conditions, which is not what we really want to see across most of this area, to be honest. Now, getting to the questions. Yeah, so Bryce Anderson asks if we will if we can give a brief description of the atmospheric features which will be this summer that are driving the prospect of cooler and wetter trends. And Dennis, do you want to, another one of our partners on this call is USDA, Dennis Toddy, USDA Climate Hub out of Ames, Iowa, and I just want to give him a chance to say a few words perhaps about that.
Yeah, there's a couple things, several pieces that fit into this. A big player in this is the strong connection at the land surface that goes in the summertime between wetter conditions and cooler conditions and dry and warm. That is basically when your soils and land surface is wet, anytime you have solar radiation, you partition part of that solar radiation into evaporating or transpiring water instead of heating the surface. Latent versus sensible heating, for those of you who've dealt with that. So that's a big player in this situation. We've had a recurring large ridge over the southeastern U.S., extension of the Bermuda High, that has created a clockwise circulation, bringing a lot of moisture up into the Gulf of Mexico. And there have been a number of systems then that have been able to tap into that moisture who've come across the Rockies. So that combination has been one that's been a recurring pattern in this situation. But a big driver in this whole thing is a local impact, with just being lots of water locally, keeping temperatures cooler overall. I don't know if Kelsey or Doug, you want to add on to that?
Well, just simply the fact that wet, like we say during a drought, sort of dry conditions beget dry conditions. So it's just sort of the same thing with wet conditions lead to more wet conditions. So at least that's the tendency, and that actually does give you some forecasting skill broadly across a region like this. The other thing to mention is the potential influence, and this is a harder thing to prove, I guess you could say, but it does tend to happen, is that during El Nino summers, which are pretty rare that they hang on this long, and not that it's strong in any way, shape, or form, but there does seem to be a little bit more at least available moisture or something like that, or energy, allowing for more precipitation across the central part of the U.S., which, Dennis, again, this is from your PhD, tends to be more the rule than not. Is that right?
Yeah. Summertime El Niños typically are better for crop production unless you are as wet as we are right now, then they become a negative. A cool, wet July would, in most cases, be a positive thing for crop production. Not this year because we're so late in planting and development.
Okay, moving down. Well, I'm going to handle this one. So we were also asked. Someone heard a comment, and I don't know. The comment was that it's been cool and wet and it's the beginning of the ice age. So what I'll say to that is just simply, I just sent out to most of you who are on the climate list that that we have here for this part of the region that it was the fourth warmest May in the world. If you look at sort of global maps of what's happening around the world, sort of on any regular basis, you'll see two colors, blue and red. Red being above normal temperatures, blue being below normal temperatures. For the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, you see a preponderance of red temperatures around the globe. Right now, in this part of the country, it is below normal, and that's, but not by much, and it's certainly surrounded by a lot of above normal temperatures. So, no ice age coming on the horizon. So, thanks for the comment, but we're gonna move on. There is a general question and interest about the duration of the flooding, and has it been longer than in 1993 in places other than Rock Island, Illinois. And I think I know we have a number of people on here who are in the hydro world who could probably answer that better than the three of us. But does anybody want to take a shot at that? Or does anybody want to comment on the line on that knows absolutely for sure, one way or the other?
Yeah, it'd be good to have our hydro friends chime in, because it seems like 93 had a long period of time of wetness, but I'd like to have the hydro folks chime in.
Yeah, if you're a hydro dude, one of our favorites. Kevin Stam, was that something you want to talk about? I don't know. I'm sure it's before your time, but or anybody else. If you have an answer to that, type it in there, and I'll unclick you and let you talk if you want to. Type it into the question part. So there are differences between 1993, but there are some similarities too in the fact that you have a lot of Gulf moisture, like Dennis said, moving into the Midwest. That certainly was the case in May, and actually months before that, plenty of moisture, plenty of cold air, plenty of wringing out that warm, moist air, and thus the flooding. So that's similar to 1993. The setup atmospherically is slightly different, but certainly there are similarities. Can someone explain the rank of, what the rank of precipitation means when we talk about ranking? Can you go back to the ranking slides real quick? And actually, just go to the month of May, if you will, Kelsey. Yeah, that one or the next one, either way. So the rank. So every year there's a new year added. So next year when we show these slides, hopefully we won't show you that Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri are 126 out of 126 wettest. So that's what those rankings are. There's 125 years of period of record for both precipitation and temperature, and that's what you're seeing there. And when they're colorized one way or the other, it's kind of telling you which way we're trying to explain it. So 125 is the wettest by far. It is the record, whereas 1 would be the driest if you saw that. You can see in the temperature too, we're very cold or very cool there for May, from Canada to Mexico, basically from North Dakota down to the Four Corners states. So let's see, any other questions?
Doug, this graphic also illustrates what I was trying to talk about before about that ridge over the southeast. With that ridge of high pressure throughout a chunk of May, you had very warm conditions and fairly dry conditions on the right-hand side, whereas we had a big trough over the central US, which was cold and wet. So you can kind of imagine a big dip in the jet over the country, and then moving northeastward over the eastern part of the US.
Yeah, and we have another comment. I think this is out of Indiana, tracking that, or trying to keep track of how 2019 compares to past years, and they're comparing it to 1960 back in that area, and that 2019 is keeping pace with and may pass 1960 soon. The other thing I'll say about runoff and the amount of water in all of the rivers is, and something we talked about the last few months, but not this month on this particular webinar, is that for the last 12 months, May of 2019 and back, okay, for the last year, if you will, has been record wet across a lot of these same areas. So we've had and that's why river conditions or river levels are staying up even when we're not seeing a lot of heavy precipitation and such. It is just there's just a lot of water to go, if you will. Now, when we get precipitation on top of that, it just doesn't take much to have considerable runoff. Last year in the upper Missouri, it was considered the third highest runoff year. It has just gotten beaten out, if you will, by this year, which is going to be the second, and second only to 2011. So 2011, we have the record runoff in the upper Missouri River. This year is number 2, and last year is 3. So pretty interesting amount of water coming off this year for sure. That's all I have at the moment in terms of questions. Dennis, do you want to say any more about agriculture and what we're up against? Or Kelsey, for that matter, anything else you want to chime in on, or something to look forward to? I don't know. Or
the issues we've been addressing so far have shown up in the way of delayed planting and delayed development because of the cold, wet conditions. So that's captured a lot of attention. The problem right now is we have put a decent amount of seed in the ground. People have tried to make some late planting attempts here. We're going to run into a lot of ongoing issues. People put crops in the ground in many cases when it was too wet, which leads to compaction. And that compaction can be limiting to root development and emergence. The heavy rainfalls have caused crusting on the top of soils that has limited sometimes soybeans from being able to break through that. And then we have the ongoing wetness leading to more disease. We had really bad weed issues because weed control, people have not been able to do weed control. So we have a lot more issues in ag that are going to be ongoing this year. And then simply just the delayed development. We need some warmer temperatures to help push, especially corn along. And look like there'll be some periods of warmth, but the overall outlooks don't give us a lot of optimism towards helping push corn along to reach development by the end of the year. So there's going to be a lot of carryover issues that go on into the end of the year, and there are some hints that the wetness could continue into fall, which would just exacerbate the problems. You're going to have people waiting for crops to mature in the field, and if it stays wet, that's going to limit their ability to get out there as the fall goes on. So it's still a potential for a lot more problems in agriculture as we go along.
And even another good comment from Brian Fuchs. Any comments on the nutritional value of the forage and fungus disease issues that you want to bring up, Dennis or Kelsey?
Yeah, good comment. The pasture and rangeland, the additional moisture has generally been good for pasture and rangeland to grow. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. But from pasture land, oftentimes people have to cut it so they can store the hay. With repeated rainfalls, it's hard to get that cut and let it dry out. So there's been a problem there. And the disease issues are starting to pop up across various parts of it. Wheat, winter wheat, which is reaching its maturity now. We're getting disease problems on winter wheat because of the excess precipitation. Wheat is quite susceptible to wetter conditions. Wheat works better in dry-ish areas that take advantage of spring moisture. So while we do have a positive on some parts of this, the wheat acreage is probably going to produce pretty well. We've got some downsides to this also. So it's ag is really having a big struggle overall this year.
And Kelsey, do you have anything else you would like to comment on?
No, I think Dennis hit it all. Brian, you bring up a good point, and I don't know enough about the subject to comment on it wisely. But I know that while moisture is good, a period of dryness is also important for building protein content for certain crops. So it's not just how much is planted, but also a period of slightly drier conditions to help build protein content. And I would let you guys comment on that. I know you know more about that than I do.
I'm going to I think Mary Knapp may have a comment. Mary, if you do, you're live.
All right, I'm live. One thing I also wanted to mention on that, the cooler than normal, as Dennis already said, there is likely some warm periods in there, and the problem with the corn will be that if that coincides with its vulnerable sulking tasseling period, you could have beautiful looking corn, but you don't have any pollen to, you have lack of germination because a couple of untimely hot days, even if it doesn't skew towards warmer than normal, are going to wreak havoc on that.
Yep. That's right.
And the other problem you have with the crops that are planted into very wet soils, roots will not develop into saturated soils. So you might have poor root development, so that even though there's lots of moisture down deep in the profile, roots may not be developing deep enough to reach them. So that even though there's plenty of moisture in the soil, you could stress a crop under those, again, same warmish conditions that they pop up. So there's lots of potential problems still out there for this crop, even though it's already planted.
And not to be the harbinger of doom, but last issue I think we have to cover is, and we're not going to be able to say anything definitively on this call, but what I'll point to is the issue with an early frost or even average frost freeze. Dennis, do you want to talk about that?
We're not even going to mention early frost, Doug. That shall not be talked about. We need, at worst, near average freeze conditions to allow this crop to develop as long as it can. If some early should come along, that would be very problematic. Even if it's late, we're still going to have some crops that have not reached maturity by that point. And for those of you who know more about ag, also corn, it may be mature, but it still may be very wet, very high moisture. There's a certain moisture level that has to reach to be able to store, and that either has to be done in the field or it has to be dried. And if you have to dry it, there's an additional cost for drying. So there's a number of issues with that also. So we don't at this point know anything one way or the other about freeze frost conditions other than average dates. We can't see anything that far ahead.
Yeah, and I guess on our next call or the one following that, July or August, we will start getting into the fall outlooks and such. Not that we're going to be able to predict that then either, but we can certainly start seeing the way we're going to start leaning as we go into the fall and winter. So thanks everybody. This is a very good presentation. Thank you, Kelsey, for a very professional presentation, and Dennis for your added comments. I think we're going to stop the recording and hang up. See you next month. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.